Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm Alec Baldwin. Thank you. Hi, how are you? So just very quickly, because I want to spend as much of our time as we can with our panel and our panelists. This is kind of the revival, if you will, of the Hamptons Institute. It's kind of a lofty name, but under the support of Mickey Strauss. We had some Hamptons Institute programming that went on for several years. We're going to have someone come out and speak about that in a moment. And then we decided to put this together again this summer. We have tonight's program, which is about the coming election. On the 22nd, we have another program about the Supreme Court that I'm going to be the moderator of with Adam Liptak from the New York Times, Michael Keegan from People for the American Way, and Michael Waldman from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. And then on the 29th, our last program of the three is an assessment of the Obama presidency with Monica Crowley. We have Kurt Anderson. Say again? Katie Couric is the host. Who's the other person we have coming? No, okay. I was saving that. Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. And Bill O'Reilly is coming all the way from Montauk. Bill, all the way from Montauk. He's traveling to be here with us. So that's going to be a great program hosted by Katie Couric. But I just want to say that obviously we thought that this season, we booked the Supreme Court program before Scalia passed away, and we've been crafting this for several months. And we really are very excited because as enthusiastic as I was about these possibilities, everything has come together wonderfully. We have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful panel tonight and every night. So, but I want to introduce someone to speak about the Hamptons Institute for a moment before we get on with our panel, who is the wife of the late Mickey Strauss. Please help me welcome Layla Strauss.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Unfortunately, I can hardly see a thing, but I just thought I'd tell the little story of how my husband, Mickey Strauss, and Jeff Tarr launched the Hamptons Institute back in the summer of 2010, and there was a great movement afoot. A lot of people wanted more discourse, and more discussion. Even though we were all supposed to be on holiday in the Hamptons, people wanted that stimulation, and there was quite a demand for a program to be instituted, a little like the Aspen Institute, but maybe not quite so all-consuming. But I have to say, they pulled it off, and Ellen Chesler, who was working for the Roosevelt Institute, she got very heavily involved, and we have to thank Ellen for having brought along in those early days some wonderful participants, only equal to the participants that we have for this season. So Ellen, thanks to you wherever you are. Anyway, we're all delighted that the board has decided to relaunch the Institute at a time when the topics are so incredibly relevant and the discourse much needed. Mostly thanks to Alec for bringing back the program. His efforts have been amazing, and here he is to introduce the panelists.
Thank you. Let's have a big round of applause for Layla, who she and her husband have been great. Her late husband, one of the great, great, great champions of this institution here and of the Hamptons Institute. So before we get started with our panel, I want to mention the biography of this man is very, very estimable. But I want to just say that I'm going to skip down. There's a list of names of people that he has written about and books that he's written and things that he's published. But at the end of this bio, it says his 2001 profile of Ted Turner won a National Magazine Award as the best profile. Is that Ted Turner calling us now? Tell Ted to hold on until about 9:30, then we'll get back to him. Let's turn off our phones if we can, as a courtesy to our guests here. His 2001 profile of Ted Turner won a National Magazine Award as the best profile of the year. He covered the Microsoft antitrust trial for the magazine. In ranking him as America's premier media critic, the Columbia Journalism Review concluded no other reporter has covered the new communications revolution as thoroughly as has Auletta. New York Magazine described him as the media Boswell. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for this evening, Ken Auletta.
Thank you. Why don't we bring out our guests? This No. Oh, okay. All four of our guests have roots in Suffolk County. Katrina Vanderhoevel is a regular renter in East Hampton. John J. LaValle, I'm going to call him John J. because we have two Johns here tonight. John J. LaValle is the Suffolk County Republican chairman. Howard Dean, whose family goes back, I didn't know this till tonight, to the 17th century out here. And John Podhoretz, whose family for years had a home in this area. So welcome and thank you for doing this, folks. A word about format. We're just going to have a conversation up here. I've asked no speeches, just try and converse. We'll do that until around 8 o'clock, and then we'll turn to audience questions. We hope to end around 8:15. Let me begin by asking a question to all of the four panelists. The majority of voters clearly signify by every poll that they don't trust either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Each of you, tell us why they should. Who'd like to be
John
first?
Podhoretz.
I know what you're going to say, John.
They shouldn't.
Why, John?
Well, Hillary is a prevaricator of extraordinary standing, and the difficulties that she has with the truth and telling the truth about what happened with her emails and that sort of thing. Her negatives are well earned, and Donald Trump's negatives are obviously extraordinarily well earned. So, and need no elaboration from anybody who reads the newspaper on a daily basis or reads Twitter on a minute-by-minute basis. So we find ourselves in an unprecedented situation that I think means, in the extremely unlikely event that, say, Donald Trump becomes president, he will largely become president because of Hillary Clinton's negatives, and the reverse will be true of Hillary Clinton, and that will raise very serious questions about whether either of them has any kind of a governing mandate if they get elected solely because of national disaffection with their rival, which poses interesting governing challenges, I think, for the next 4 years.
Howard?
So I've known Hillary Clinton for 25 years, and I like her, and I think she's truthful. So I do. And as many of you know, I pretty much say what I think. So if I didn't think that, I think she gets a bad rap. I think she doesn't have the political skills that her husband has, but I think she does have the management skills, maybe more so. She's fact-based. She cares what the facts are. She's not particularly ideological. And I think that, and she's enormously experienced, particularly in foreign affairs. So I think she's going to be a great president. I think she is going to be president.
John Jay?
Well, to begin, I think a large part of the problem right now in this country is that people are angry at their government. Their government has failed them. They feel betrayed, regardless of what party it is and what individual you're talking about. So none of the individuals in Washington poll very well. The institution itself doesn't poll very well because it has failed America. We are in a crisis situation as a country, both domestically and internationally. As far as the two candidates are concerned, I have a slightly different view than the governor. I don't think that, Donald Trump is a trustworthy person. The problem with Donald Trump that some people have is that they don't like what he says. He does say what he thinks, and one of his challenges that he's had to meet over the course of this campaign is he is a businessman. He is a private individual, has a public persona, but he's a private individual, and he's not used to the political talk. And when we grow up in this business and we go through this business, you tend to learn, how to say things and what to say. A private individual is not going to have that lifetime of training. So it's, you're going to see, that is the case with Donald Trump. He's overly honest in a lot of people's minds. He's not a dishonest person whatsoever. Now, if you roll forward to Hillary Clinton, she hasn't been very honest about a lot of things, and things that actually really, really matter. And that's a problem. When you're dishonest about some blatant things, whether it's, I've released 33,000 emails disappear overnight. Most people get charged with a crime for that. That's quite unfortunate. Then all my work-related emails were released. And then they find 44, and those 44 are pretty damning. That's a problem. But there's a lot of things. The foundation, the substance of those emails, it goes to what I perceive to be, quite frankly, and what the majority of Americans perceive to be, almost 7 out of 10, a lifetime of dishonesty, an inclination to lie when put on the spot. Trump won't do that, and to some people, they say they might have wished he did, but he's blatantly honest. Even if you don't like what he says, you have to respect the fact that he's saying what he thinks.
Wait.
I understand the crowd tonight, by the way. It's all good.
But now I also understand, I feel the smoke coming out of your ears.
No, I wanted to step back, and I think we're at a moment in our country's history. This is a rewrite the rules election, upending all assumptions, and it's that there's a fundamental lack of trust in a lot of institutions in this country. The Trump phenomenon can be explained in a lot of different ways. He's Frankenstein of the GOP's making, but he's also someone who, with dog whistle racism, bigotry, and xenophobia, is speaking to thousands of people who feel left behind and shafted by an elite, which has failed this country. It has failed in its foreign policy. It has failed in globalization. It has failed in these trade deals. And I think it's not so much the two candidates and who do you trust, but there is a rigged system. I will, to the end of my days, dispute Donald Trump's idea that the rigged system is voting fraud, which doesn't exist in this country. The only fraud is Republicans who keep millions of people from voting and expanding democracy. But we live in this moment of distrust, partly because the system has failed. Millions. Howard Dean talks a lot about this. And there's a media. I'll finish with this. But last summer, I bet all of you, if you're here tonight on this hot day for this discussion, the media malpractice of 2015 was wall-to-wall coverage of Donald Trump rallies. And treating Donald Trump as a reality show, which he is, not taking him seriously, you come into this moment, and I think a lot of the media, and there are different media in this country, but a lot of the media feel repentant that they didn't hold Trump accountable to lying, misinformation. And now they're all in. They're all in to the point that even when Donald Trump, who's a lousy messenger on all kinds of things, says something like, maybe we don't need a new Cold War, instead of listening or having a serious debate, the media is smearing. I think Donald Trump is the lousiest, worst messenger for an alternative foreign policy, but my husband, Stephen Cohen, who is here tonight, we understand that if you don't have a debate in this country about an alternative foreign policy, you will have a Hillary Clinton who is more hawkish. I'll end by saying, I don't trust politicians. I trusted Howard Dean a little in 2004 when the nation supported him. I trusted, we endorsed Bernie Sanders. But I believe that all politicians have to be held accountable. And that is the role of the media, to hold those in power, political power, corporate power, accountable, and that the movements make politicians do things they might not otherwise do. It goes back, Franklin Roosevelt, if you remember, said, go out and make me do it, to all of those who came to him and said, do this, do this, do that. I think Bernie Sanders played that role in this election, and I think trust is going to be hard for these two candidates, but we need to rebuild trust in a system and not lose the millions of young people who were so inspired by Bernie Sanders. Don't lose them. They are the future, and they've been politicized and inspired.
John,
I just like to pull even further back from 2015, because of course the great question of this election is, how did it become this rule-changing election? And we don't really know. In fact, we won't know until November whether it truly was. I mean, the way things are shaping up, it may turn out to be a relatively conventional election, very comparable to the 1988 election, in which Hillary Clinton wins a third term the way, for Barack Obama, the way George H.W. Bush won a third term for Ronald Reagan. But I think something interesting happened in our political life that we haven't really reckoned with, which is that if you think back to 2008, the central economic fact of our lifetimes, or our recent lifetimes, was the financial meltdown, which happened 7 weeks before the 2008 election. And the die was cast, the circumstances were set. The election was between McCain and Obama. McCain didn't respond that well. Obama responded more calmly. The headwinds were against McCain. Obama gets elected. Imagine that the meltdown happened a year earlier. Imagine that it happened in September '07. And the market sinks by half. People's home values go down 35%. There is a huge spate of bankruptcies and home repossessions and all of that. I think that the populist bounce back would have been then. The country was denied in an odd way its political response to this gigantic formative event, because the election was already basically set. And then in 2012, the election was, as elections really will be, a referendum on Barack Obama, who of course had nothing to do with the meltdown of 2008, could not be held responsible for it, so it could not really be a referendum on his handling. It could be if you think the stimulus was bad or good. In the end, that's what Mitt Romney tried, and it didn't quite work. I think that what's going on here is a delayed reaction to the fact that people only just now are getting to par from where they were. And I'm not now talking about the dispossessed working class whites. I'm talking about, everybody, the middle class, who lost enormous amounts of value in their 401ks and in their homes, and never had a chance to express themselves politically about this. And so you had this total outsider on the one hand, and then you had this coronation in the Democratic Party that was interrupted by an insurgent. And if you actually look at it, you might think to yourself, well, this election in the end may come down to, the rational candidate being the winner, but what we've been through over the last 15, 16 months really is a public response to an enormous event that politically was never.
But Howard, as someone who ran a populist presidential campaign, do you believe that the argument that John is making about the frustration, pent-up frustration the public feels, this is a permanent thing we're going to be dealing with, that there is a populist movement, or is it a temporary movement?
That depends how the next administration responds. I think John is largely right, although I think there's some factors that you didn't talk about. One is demographics. This country has changed dramatically. This is the first year in American history where there are more kids of color entering kindergarten than there are white kids. And that is reflected in the demography all over the country. You can't, for the Republican Party, you can't exist much longer in a party that is, let's just say, 88 or 90% white in terms of the people who vote for them. It's just because it doesn't work in a country that is not 90% white anymore, and it's not even close. So the anti-immigration stuff, we won every single ethnic group except one, which was Vietnamese Americans, in the last election. That wouldn't have happened. Asian Americans almost always voted for Republicans because they often came and they were immigrants and they were small business people, and small business people tend to vote for Republicans because they think the Democrats are too bureaucratic and so forth. All that changed with the anti-immigration talk, and now we get with the exception of Vietnamese Americans who vote for the Republicans because they are similar in some ways ideologically to the Cuban Americans who escaped from a communist regime and blame the Democrats for not being tougher on the Vietnamese communists. But that's a tiny sliver of the immigration population. So I think it's true. What John says is absolutely true about the alienation. The other thing I'd like to, I think though, I don't think it's entirely a delayed reaction. I think the problem is it hasn't gotten better. The wealth distribution problem really is a problem. I don't say that because I'm a left-wing Democrat and think we ought to redistribute everything. if you just look at what's happened, the average working class or middle class person has not gotten ahead, not just for the last 8 years, for the last 20 years.
40.
Almost all of the wealth that's been created in this country is going to the top 20%, and most of that's going to the top 1%. I'm not saying this because I think we all ought to be socialists. I'm saying this because the public doesn't think this is fair. They think they're working really hard and they're not getting ahead. The student debt crisis is an enormous problem. And so these middle-class people who got really screwed in 2008 with a collapse, not only did they not come back fully, but their kids are now burdened with this enormous debt that they can never pay. And nobody's doing anything serious about that. I mean, at least there's talk about it now. I personally,
No, I mean,
I like the rhetoric, but free college for everybody is not going to work unless you figure out a way to pay for it.
But, I mean, with all due respect to Howard Dean's campaign, which was a very important one, it opened, but it was more about Iraq, Howard. I mean,
I agree with that.
I didn't think Howard Dean was a populist. I mean, I do think, I agree with John that we're seeing delayed reaction, not just to the financial crisis, but Occupy Wall Street. I mean, it wasn't a linear movement, but it opened people's eyes. The discussion of inequality soared. And I do think you've seen in this campaign an extraordinary progressive populist temper. The danger is that there's a kind of equivalence drawn between, look, the insurgent Bernie Sanders and Trump, when in fact Bernie Sanders is about fair economic progressive populism, about solidarity, turning toward, not on, not dividing people. But I think we've seen action too, Howard. I mean, around this country, 15 minimum wage, what we're seeing move, what we've seen in a progressive, that democratic platform, and I believe in platforms, I believe you hold politicians accountable to those, is the most progressive democratic platform in modern, in history. And I think it took, again, I come back, Sanders isn't going away. Now, Howard may disagree because what he did after he was defeated was start Democracy for America. Right. But to keep the populist temper going in this country, you need to run candidates from Congress to sheriff to school board, and you need to keep the movements alive to push for these issues. And you have in the Democratic Party an ascendant progressive wing. If the Senate goes Democratic, Bernie Sanders would be head of the Health, Education, Pension Committee, Sherrod Brown, Banking, Jeff Merkley, White House, Elizabeth Warren. You got a real caucus there who could cause a ruckus.
But this is your, but I just want to say, I'm
So I agree, it could be a restoration of Clinton.
Let's hear John Jay.
And there's a lot of great points being made, but we're avoiding, once again, the facts in America. There are 14 million less Americans working today than 7 years ago. There are 7 million more people impoverished today than 7 years ago. In fact, while the president may have been well-intentioned, he hasn't been successful. Minorities have been disproportionately affected by this economy. So it's not working. It's not working at all, not even for the people that it was intended to work for. We have almost $800 billion trade deficit. We cannot continue to do that. If we do not learn how to employ middle America, we're in trouble. We don't manufacture like we used to. We need to do that. Trump's plan to repatriate money at 10%, to reorganize our tax structure so that it's more simplified, to get rid of the incentives for companies to build jobs over America. We need to employ Americans. A large portion of the social unrest in this country is because people aren't employed. People can't, home ownership is at its lowest point since 1951. Those are facts. There's a lot of concepts and everyone has their ideas of how to fix it, but we have to put our arms around the facts and we have to realize that America's not working. Americans specifically are not working, and we need to start to focus on rebuilding America. So, this concept of let's make America great again, it's not just a TV show rhetorical phrase. It's about rebuilding America. It's about a country that pays its farmers not to farm, but children are going to sleep hungry at night in America. It's about policies that we're sending money to build housing overseas, but Americans are homeless here in America. It doesn't make sense. And by the way, I'll end with this. The platform issue, I don't necessarily agree with, because what we do is we say, if you're a Republican, you're this, no matter who you are. And if you're a Democrat, you're that, no matter who you are. My guess is that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, or somewhere here and here and here and here, and we got to pick it out and mesh it. One of the things that I love about Donald Trump is that he's being called out by Republicans because he's not, carrying the Republican flag every day of the week. And he's calling out Republicans whom he thinks are betraying Americans and the average Americans. To me, that's the type of person that we need. We don't need, I find it ironic that with all of these scandals hovering around Hillary Clinton, not one Democrat has come out and said, hey, Bernie Sanders got ripped off, period, end of statement. They said it all along, and then the email surfaced proving it, factual information, that the Democrat National Committee was orchestrating this primary campaign against Bernie Sanders. It's a fact now. Bernie Sanders was saying it, now it's proven.
Let's get some.
As the former DNC chair, I would just say that's nonsense.
It's true. It's in the emails.
No, it's not true. What he had was a few whiny employees, some of whom I knew, who were complaining about Bernie Sanders, and a chair who was, shall we say, was less than neutral. That does not change elections, and it doesn't run campaigns. It just means the DNC should have been neutral, and they weren't. It had nothing to do with the outcome of the election, which was won fair and square by 3 million votes by Hillary Clinton.
Just briefly, I thought this.
John, wait, John.
Sorry.
Besides which, look, I'm not going to, I'm not here to defend.
You're not going to weigh in on the DNC?
But in 1988, the Republican National Committee was an arm of the George H.W. Bush campaign. Yeah. Bush had 7 people running against him. Let's be, let's be honest about how these things work. Of course, the front runner, who is basically the person anointed by the head of the party, in all but name, is going to get the lion's share of the help of the DNC. Everybody knew this was going on. Everybody knew that Debbie Wasserman Schultz was scheduling debates to help Hillary and not to help Sanders. It's a silly point. The point that the most important thing about it, is how well Sanders did from a standing start. That's the issue, and that is where it combines with Trump.
And what you were saying,
Sanders got the same percentage of the Democratic vote that Trump got of the Republican vote. Just think about that. Trump got about 44% of the Republican primary vote, and so did Bernie Sanders. Hillary Clinton, as it happened, got 56, and all the other Republicans added up got 56. But if you think about it, what that suggests is a common disaffection with different ideological roots and different anger points and different pressure points. And I'm not a fan of Trump's, to put it mildly, and I don't like what he says, and I'm very distressed by how many people voted for him. Having said that, I am extremely distressed as well by the fact that so many people voted for Bernie Sanders, who I think represents a view of America and the world and the economy that was properly discredited and is now, largely because there is no countervailing weight across the world to show us what evil socialism can do.
John, if I could ask you a quick question.
Could I just say, Bernie Sanders was a 21st century New Dealer. And I want to say, I agree with you, jobs. We got to put people back to work. That is a big debate. That is something this election should be about. Then you veer off into Hillary, and we hear about crooked Hillary, but putting people back to work, infrastructure investment is something both candidates speak to. I will say that Trump's rollout the other day of his economic plan, with the exception of sort of 19th century attacks on trade and the fact that it is interesting to hear him take on the Republican establishment. It's very interesting to see someone run against his own party, though he's a creature of it in some ways. But it was recycled Republican pap. It was anti-regulation. It was tax cuts for the richest. There was nothing novel. There was nothing really populist about that. Bernie Sanders, I think, did a great service for this nation, John. He brought ideas into the politics. He brought fairness and a sense of economic justice. And he spoke to people who've been shafted by the elites and did so without the kind of, I don't know what you're trying to do. The red baiting just seems so old-fashioned these days, though it's not.
Why red baiting?
Yes, doesn't it?
Because he's
Yeah, we
alluding
have a
to
former
forces
KGB
across
agent about
the
to
ocean.
invade Ukraine, and you're telling me that red betting is old-fashioned?
Well, no, but George Will did something, and I think, George Will talked about Bernie Sanders campaigning in honeymooning in the Soviet Union in 1988. That was the same year, I recall, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev strolled together through Red Square. But this kind of stuff should be
I
put
don't know
out of our
why you're
politics.
tagging me with a joke that George Will made. That's not the point. The point is that Bernie Sanders,
You said
you should be happy, Katrina. 43% of young people
Yeah.
say that they like socialism, which I think is a horror. It's a horror of the 21st century. That our young people are so ignorant that they no longer understand what a country governed by socialism can look like and can do. Having said that,
Denmark, Norway, Nordic model.
Fine.
I mean, no, I'm serious.
yeah,
I mean,
they're.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying.
Could I-
there's no reason
excuse
to have
me.
these arguments. I'm
Could I-
just saying.
Different-
John,
This debate's
let,
about.
let the moderator take
Please.
this point of person and move this subject. Katrina mentioned, we're not going to talk anymore, if we can, about Bernie Sanders and socialism. We're talking about this campaign this year. And Katrina made a point earlier, the first comment you made. You talked about the press's responsibility. I'd like to hear from you, because there are two different arguments made. One is that the press created Trump. The other that Trump makes now is that the press is trying to destroy him out of their own bias. John Jay, what's your view about the press?
There's no question the press has been unbelievably biased. There's no question about that. And by the way, 7 out of 10 Americans think this country's moving in the wrong directions. Like 9 out of 10 Americans do not believe that they believe the press is biased. I mean, they are biased. The other day, Donald Trump gives a speech about the economy, and whether you like or dislike it, it was a great speech. It certainly laid things out in detail. No question about it. It's a candidate for president of the United States, laid out a detailed economic plan. It was substantive. It was radical in a lot of instances. And, later on in the evening, he goes to a rally and speaks for an hour and a half and makes one comment, one line that nobody in the room took the way that the media took it. They took it, they spun it, there they go with it.
Didn't the media take it the way Trump said?
No, not at all. And no one in the room agreed with what the media
Are we
said
talking
on that.
about the Second Amendment?
Yes.
Comment?
So at the end of the day,
Are we living on the same planet?
well, the bottom line is there's two issues in every poll that you're going to see, and every poll from the start of this campaign, and it'll be through the end of this campaign, that is important to the American people. The economy is number one, and terrorism and ISIS is number two. And it's not even close for number three. Yet we're not talking about those issues. We have a broken economy. We have a failed system. We have Americans out of work. We're sending jobs overseas. We're not a safe society anymore. The world is at its best when America is at its strongest. And what we need to do is look introspectively, and we need to start to look at our economy. We need to pay attention to America, put Americans back to work, get America healthy again. And then we could be the true positive world influence that we always were. We're never going to get there if we're weak. Other countries sense our weakness, whether it's Russia or any other of these terroristic countries out there. They sense our weakness. They know we're weak. They know look at the social unrest in the streets. It's because Americans aren't working. We're not proud. There's a sense of pride when you have a home, when you're providing for your family. That's not there in America. It's not there predominantly. Lowest home ownership since 1951. Think of that. Since the 50s. Yeah, and I'll say it 10 times because that is a disgrace. Complete disgrace.
So,
John Jay, let's get Howard.
So first of all, a couple of things. I suspect I'm the oldest person on this panel. So one of the advantages of that is my father once reminded me that I can look backwards as well as forwards. There is almost no violence in the street. I remember what it was like in the 60s when 99 cities were burned down. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. The Chicago Convention blew up after having nominated somebody who'd run in 3 primaries in the back room. That was the violence in the streets. I think we've come a long way. I think America is a great nation, and nobody ever won a presidential race by saying it wasn't. And it is a great country. Do we have a lot of things to do? Yes, we do. Can we improve on a lot of things? Yes. Have we made mistakes? Yes. We're still a great country, and I think in many ways we're the greatest country, not because Americans are better than Europeans or Africans or Asians, but because of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the things that we expect of each other, even though we don't always deliver them. Now, I don't like the media. I think it's one of the 3 failed institutions in this country, along with Wall Street and Congress. But I do have a rule that I learned the hard way. If you said it and the press writes it, that is not the press's fault. So when you say that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are the founders of ISIS and that gets in the paper, that is not the press's fault. They are simply writing down what you said. Anyway,
You agree with that, John Jay?
Oh, no, I agree it's fair game. Anytime a candidate,
No, no, do
I
you
was
agree-
a candidate in public office. I served for 10 years in public office. If you say something, you are going to be held accountable for it. And
So in that case, he was right. Trump was rightly held to account for the ISIS comment?
any comment that any candidate makes at that point in time, they are rightly held for it. But what the media isn't doing is, listen, they're there to sell advertising. That's how they make their money. And whatever's sexiest for them at that point in time, they're going to do. But the truth is, their job, and the reason why they get this sanctity of, freedom of speech and the protections that they have, is that they should be talking about the issues that are most important to America. Their job was to be honest. And their job was to put force the politicians to be open. They're essentially our connection to our government. And they failed.
But
they're more interested in selling advertisement than telling the truth, than talking about the issues that are important.
Katrina?
So we've been here before, but it's particularly acute with Donald Trump because there's a kind of post-factual world he has created. But we've been there. We were there with McCarthy. We were there in the Iraq War. Don't forget, the media let us down. I mean, they were sold a war, and many, with few exceptions, just accepted what they heard from political leaders, Cheney, others. And I think the media needs to challenge assumptions, needs to hold people accountable. You're right that what's happened in these last 30 years, 40, is news has become a small cog in media conglomerates. So you saw last summer enormous, 2.5 billion free airtime given to Donald Trump by some estimates. And the head of CBS, Les Moonves, said, he may be bad for the country, but he's good for CBS. So you get that going. But I think that journalists need to think hard, how do we cover Donald Trump? Because it's not simply enough, Howard, it seems to me, to report what he says. Objectivity has been obliterated in a sense. But you need to give
Katrina,
context.
You run a nonprofit ideological.
No, it's not. It has been for-profit for 151
congratulations.
years.
It's a for-profit ideological
and it's not
publication. I run
ideological.
a
John, wait a
nonprofit.
minute.
Okay.
We are honest about our values. We are honest from where we stand. We fact-check, which I think is important with a Donald Trump, and the media came
I'm not accusing you of anything.
But I'm just saying that I'm not standing here as some weird exotic beast.
I didn't say you were a weird exotic beast. I'm saying
Let John
there are two different elements here, okay? I'm saying, I wasn't criticizing you. I was likening, so I run a ideologically conservative publication that is nonprofit. Katrina runs a for-profit, ideologically leftist publication, and we are freed by the nature of the way that we work, in part, to speak openly and honestly because we are advocating for we are evangelizing for specific points of view about how the world works and how the world should be. What happened in 2015 with the media that was so startling was that the for-profit media had a candidate who was so new and startling and interesting that all standards of practical fairness went out the window. There was 60 times the amount of coverage of Donald Trump that there was of other candidates on the Republican side. I don't blame anybody in some sense for that. It was all fresh and new. A lot of us thought that 6 months was going to be the burnout point. That's what's interesting, is we thought, okay, look, this is insane, and by December, everyone's going to wake up and say, this is crazy. Who is this lunatic who is ranting on my television every night?
So can I just...
And it didn't happen then. It took until July is what happened. It took 13 months instead of 6. And it's not the media's fault, to be honest. It isn't. The media didn't invent the fact that there was an interesting candidate. What changed here is that there's an incentive structure in the for-profit media that got out of whack. The notion that maybe the best way to make money and sell advertising would be to cover these races straight on went out the window, because the idea was, look at this, you put Trump on and you get twice the rating.
Okay, so here's what the dilemma is, and here's how we got here. And I don't know what the solution is. I actually think the free market is going to fix this, because the internet is going to essentially dissolve this media that isn't working. So when I was growing up, and when some of you were growing up, there were 3 major sources of news: ABC, NBC, and CBS. And at night, everybody in America, 90% of people in America, sat down and watched the news. John Edwards' love child was never going to get on Walter Cronkite, because it had nothing to do with defense, job creation, the economic situation, and it was just never going to get on there. What happened? The media was corporatized. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. With the exception of Rupert Murdoch, I don't think the General Electric used to tell NBC what they could and couldn't say. That wasn't the problem with the corporatization. It's a much bigger problem, which actually these guys have both put their fingers on, and that is that when the media became corporatized, General Electric, and I love General Electric, it's a great company and all that, but they didn't give a damn what was on the news. They did give a damn if the evening news made a profit, and it didn't. Walter Cronkite was a big lots leader, and Bill Paley was happy to have him, because he was the most respected man in America, and they made all their money back on, Meet the Price or Press or whatever. Yeah. What was the next one? What was the? What was Bill? Right. Bill Price is Right. Bill Cullen, right? Meet the Price. So right, Meet the Price. Yeah. So it worked in a sense, because there was an editor. There were 3 editors that decided what was important and what wasn't. Today, it's the lowest common denominator. What bleeds leads. So Donald Trump is a phenomenon. I have a contract with MSNBC. They would interrupt shows to take his phone call on the air. I never heard of such a thing. I finally said, look, this is a liberal Democratic station. Why are you doing this? He said, because the ratings are unbelievable. They go through the roof when Donald Trump is on. And if we stop doing it, our ratings go down and somebody else's go up. So no, let me just finish this. Okay. No. So the dilemma is, we now have this corporate structure in the news, and I'm not one that thinks all corporations are evil, but they are not serving what America needs in the creation of a product that needs to educate us. We need a little more of the eat your peas approach to the news that John Chancellor and Walter Cronkite and Howard K. Smith were giving us, because if we don't have somebody editing and showing us what they think is important, we get whatever we want. And sometimes when we get whatever we want, it's sex, John Edwards' love child, and horrible violence, and whack jobs like Donald Trump. And that's not healthy for America.
Right. But that gets to, reminds me of a statement Pat Moynihan made when he was a former senator. He said, you're entitled to your opinions, you're not entitled to your facts. And one of the things that has happened with the proliferation of media is that people seek out their own set of facts. So you don't have the universal. What do you do about that, John?
Well, I think something else, I'm not in disagreement with Katrina's sort of post-fact analysis of Trump, but I think something else is going on, which is, it's not just that the news has been, if it bleeds, it leads is a phrase from well before the corporatization of the news. That was a local news thing in the 60s, so that's not really right. It's not, one of the things that happened is that it turned out that you could run a television news network, a news network that had 3 million people watching and still make $1 billion. That would never have been the case 30, 40 years ago. The evening news got 11, 12 million viewers, or 13 or 14 million viewers a night, and still lost money. And Fox makes a lot of money, and MSNBC makes a lot of money, and CNN makes a lot of money, even though Fox is way ahead and all of that. I think it's that things have gotten so partisan that if Donald Trump says the sky is green, and you're a Trump supporter, and a reporter comes up to you at a rally and says, Trump said the sky is green, you're going to say, you're damn right the sky is green. Because you're not going to give the reporter, whom you think is hostile, any ground. You're a Trump supporter, and you're therefore going to say that what he said is fine. And I think, and you're going to hiss me, that everybody in this room who doesn't understand the danger to national security that was posed by Hillary Clinton running her own private server, you can admit that and still vote for her. But you should admit that, because it is true. And it is no less true that when Trump lies and everybody calls him on his lies. Hillary Clinton has done very irresponsible things. She has behaved in a corporatist way with her foundation and bled the State Department and the foundation together in ways that are very disturbing. And one of the things about politics is that you should be able to say, look, I got no choice. I got to vote for her. And I still think that there are things about her that I don't like. This is probably what's going to happen in the election. She's going to have unfavorables, and she's still going to win. And Trump's going to have more unfavorables.
John, are you going to vote for her?
I'm not voting for either of them.
Really?
Nope.
Let me just I have one announcement to make. In 10 or 15 minutes, they're going to collect any questions you have on the side for the thing. Katrina, you've been eager to say something.
Well, I wanted to come back. It is the case that John and I edit 2 publications which are honest about our values. But I think what's lost here is that there is still space, and there should be in this country, for independent thinking. I mean, the nation has criticized Hillary Clinton, has been very tough on Clinton's corporatist policies, her foreign policies. We're very obviously tough on Trump, but we also, when he raises an issue, which, he kind of does, we pick it up and try and elevate it so that it's something that's debated. So I think it's a moment in this country, and Howard talked about looking back. It is the case, in 1996, the nation did a first centerfold ever called the National Entertainment State, and it was for Occupy, it was GE, it was those big companies, and showing again what you said, that news was a small cog in this corporate structure. And what that does is it obliterates the possibility of a public trust, of raising issues that deserve a hearing. So instead of having a big debate in this election, it seems to me, the media why is the media covering every Donald Trump tweet? I mean, that's a question to ask. It gives more attention to those tweets than it does to, say, covering what's going on in Milwaukee.
Well, if Hillary Clinton
and what that means for racial justice in the election.
To be fair, Trump is the candidate of the Republican Party, and he expresses himself constantly, and Hillary Clinton is the candidate of the Democratic Party, and she runs away from public encounters.
But is that what journalism, wait a minute, is that what journalism is about, covering press conferences? Because it seems to me journalism is also about going out and doing investigation, about raising issues that deserve to be heard. There was this story the other day in the Times, which was important, that the poor the issue of poverty is barely addressed. And I'll say one more thing, though Ken told me not to mention Bernie Sanders. In the first debate, he said, remember what he said about enough with Hillary Clinton's emails?
Yeah, it was
those
the biggest
damn
political
emails?
mistake of the
No,
year.
it wasn't, because what was not covered was not so much that he didn't care about those emails, but what he next said was not covered, and it was a critique of the media. He said, what's not being covered is a shrinking middle class, 27 million living in poverty, and whether we're a democracy or an oligarchy. That was cut.
Yeah, and if
what was fixed on was the emails.
Clinton, if he had said, look, I'm not in the business of giving advice to socialist candidates for president running the Democratic Party, but if he had made his campaign partially about the corruption of Hillary Clinton, he might have won that race.
John Jay?
Do you actually doubt that that's the case?
But he wanted to run a campaign of issues, not personal corruption.
John Jay.
Personal corruption's not an issue.
This is exactly what I'm speaking about. And these are members of the media that are communicating or trying to tonight. The media has failed. There's no question. And probably the failure in America, it's a colossal failure in Washington. Actually, you had it right, actually. The three, Washington, Wall Street, and the media. The reason why they have this constitutional right is that we can have people who could run around and follow our politicians and our governmental representatives and write the stories as they're supposed to be. And it's not happening that way at all. We're not holding people's feet to the fire. And what we're not doing, even here tonight on the stage, we're not discussing the true problems in America. We're not discussing how to make our economy better. And what the governor just said to me, we could disagree on how we want to get there. First of all, America is a great country, and we're gonna persevere. But unless we have that great debate, and you may not agree with everything I have to say, and I may not agree with everything that the governor has to say, but that needs to be the focus of the debate, not some offhanded comment. And you hear, listen, Hillary, the corruption issues, they're there. But I want to know more about her economic policies, because that's what I'm concerned about. I'm more concerned about her performance as Secretary of State. I'm less concerned about a foundation. I'm less concerned about emails. I'm looking at the economic proposals. I'm looking at her experience in government, and those are where my questions are. And that's what we should be talking about.
Let me ask you a question, though. But do you believe that issues like trust, whether you trust either candidate, or issues like temperament, whether you think the candidate has the right temperament, they're not legitimately large issues?
Well, they're legitimate issues, but what we have, if we look at the polls, and by the way, polls, people, when you really break it down, it's a cheat sheet for government and politicians to ask you what you're thinking first and what's important to you, and then we should address those issues, because that's what's going to move you and your family. If the economy is something that's very important to you, if terrorism is something that's very important to you, maybe the environment is something that's very important to you, then I'm going to talk about the environment. The problem with the politicians in America is they're talking at you. They're not even listening to what you want to hear. And the media is jumping in because it's selling advertising. So you're going to pick up a newspaper, you're going to read the sexy stuff. You're going to turn on your TV, you're going to hear about all the sexy stuff today. But you're not going to hear about what's going on with the American economy. You're not going to hear about how are we going to employ Americans once again. You don't hear about those things, and it's wrong. You don't hear it at all.
There are more words written on a daily basis about the macroeconomy, the microeconomy, the Fed, the structure of jobs every day in this country, on hundreds of websites, in magazines, in newspapers.
People aren't reading like that.
Well, that's not the
what's
fault
on
of
the
the
front
people
page?
who are writing it.
Different issue.
There is no front page.
Really?
There is no front page anymore. Are you aware of that?
Look at the front page every day.
Well, congratulations.
And it's about some new little scandal.
You're about 10% of the readership in the United States, which gleans its news from what's on the front page. Everything now comes in at everybody from everywhere, largely from Facebook, as it happens. And so as a result, the notion that we're not...
Let me take this up and leave the audience.
As it happens. It was way more scandal coverage 30 years ago than there is now. It's just not true.
Let's hear from Howard Dean.
And it's not a scandal to cover a Trump tweet. There's nothing scandalous. He says something, and then...
John, let Howard Dean get a word.
So I am an optimist about the future of the country, but I want to leave you, at least maybe not leave you, but I know we're going to get into audience questions in a minute, with a couple of very serious questions that I've been thinking about a lot, because this is not an American phenomenon. The Trump phenomenon and the Brexit phenomenon and the Marine Le Pen phenomenon are all the same. This is going on all over, actually it's even going on in non-democratic countries, it's just not as obvious. And that has a lot to do with globalization and people who are left behind in globalization and resentment, and it's not just confined to the right or the left. So here's my question, and this is, I don't know what the answer to this, but I think we have to start thinking about it seriously. The question is, in a capitalist democratic society, especially one that reports its earnings quarterly, there is enormous pressure on the leadership in this country, both business and political, which is, after all, responsible for what happens. I mean, we lead, right? And a lot of people in this audience are part of that same group. There is enormous pressure to do short-term things at the expense of long-term things. Quarterly earnings are a disaster, because companies, in order to make their next earnings so as not to disappoint the analysts, do stupid things, and if they were willing to take a hit, this is why nonprofits or privately held corporations sometimes work better, because you can make a decision that's a year down the road or 3 years down the road. The same is true in democracy. We have elections every 2 years in this country. I think democracy is wonderful, but that means every politician is thinking about something 2 years from now instead of 15 or 20 years from now. And a lot of them, I teach a foreign policy course, a lot of the foreign policy mistakes we've made are because we're thinking about what's going to happen in 6 months. We would never have heard of Ayatollah Khomeini if we hadn't, along with the British, deposed the only elected government prime minister in Iran in 1953. We did it because we were afraid they were cozying up to the Russians and the British wanted their oil. We didn't think about what was going to happen. Why didn't we think about what was going to happen? Americans and democracies are particularly rewarded for short-term thinking. I don't know what the solution is. The solution is not certainly to have an illiberal democracy, as they talk about in Turkey and Hungary and Poland. But we have to figure out a way to fix this, and it requires leadership that's willing to take the hit for thinking long-term. And we have to somehow reward that leadership, not just in the political class, but also in the business class, for making long-term sensible decisions. And I don't know what the answer is, but it might not be a bad thing for you all to think about, because we're going to have to do something about it fairly quickly.
Katrina, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, I wanted to. I too, I'm an optimist in the sense, not rosy, but a belief that there's work to be done to make this a more perfect union. I don't think the media's failed. I think what isn't discussed here is there are different media. There's a cable media that's short-term. There's a cable media that goes for gore and conflict, and there's another media. I agree with Howard. I think probably what's happened in this economy, the hyper-financialization and the fetish about the short-term maximization of shareholder profit has undermined the ability to build business, to build, if people don't know about it, B corporations. It's like what business used to be. It's the triple bottom line. It's planet, community, workers. But I think we haven't talked about the corruption of the system, this idea of a rigged system, a system that works for the very few and not the many, really was at the heart, in many ways, is at the heart of this election, though it's been muted in the general. And I think the ability to get money out of our politics is something that is important if we're not going to live short-term, Howard. And I do think there are differences here. People, I've never, the idea of overturning Citizens United, we haven't talked about the fact that this election, the next president is going to appoint probably four Supreme Court justices. Citizens United and the decisions that followed opened the floodgates to big money. And the ability of ordinary people to run, to have their voices heard, to feel that they're part of something bigger than themselves, and really make a difference and not feel shafted, not feel left behind. That's going to take getting the big money out of our politics. And though I don't like big words, thank you, I will say that I think the greatest living ex-president, Jimmy Carter, used a big word the other day. And there is a fundamental question, and I'll leave it as a question, because if you can believe it, I often wake up with more questions than answers. Are we going to be a democracy or an oligarchy? And how do we remain a democracy, however imperfect? How do we become a greater country? A lot of it is getting that money out of our system.
Can I end with a question before we go to the audience questions? As the conventional wisdom 6 months ago, as John mentioned earlier, was that Trump was doomed, and it was wrong. Well, the conventional wisdom today is that Trump is doomed and Hillary is ascendant. Howard, we were talking in the room before we came out here, and I asked, and let me ask the question to the panel, how does Trump win? Howard, start.
He's got to be a little lucky. He has to do something that I don't think he's capable of doing, which is fundamentally changing his approach. The reason that I think he's not likely to win the presidency, despite the unpopularity of both candidates and all this other stuff, is at the end, in the last 3 weeks, when the votes really start to solidify, and especially the last 4 or 5 days, where the last 10% of the electorate makes up their mind. I think as the closer you get to the election, the less you act on anger and the more you act on thoughtfulness. And there are still going to be some very angry voters out there for sure. But I think you're going to have to close your eyes and imagine one of these two people as president. And I don't think only one person passes that test at this particular time. The reason I wouldn't count Trump out right now is because, first of all, my own personal track record is I've been wrong once a week for 52 weeks in a row about what's going to happen to Donald Trump. And we haven't gotten there yet. Usually, and this is 3 weeks away, the person who's leading in the polls after Labor Day, if it's a significant lead, wins. But there have been elections that have changed in the last 3 weeks. So I'm not willing to count out Trump. Yeah, he's had a couple of bad weeks. But I'm just not, I think it would be incredibly foolish, and I can assure you right now that Hillary's campaign is not counting him out.
John Jay?
How does he win? He continues to talk about and hopefully focuses solely on issues of the economy, because I think he's right about the economy. I think he's the best leader before us that fixed this economy.
If I can just
Sure, yes.
So when Corey Lewandowski, his former campaign manager, and others say, let Trump be Trump, you don't want to let him be Trump. You want him to
No,
focus on
not true. Not true. Listen, it's a growing problem. Like I said, he did not grow up in politics. And when I was first running for office, I made a lot of mistakes, but it was as a councilman in the town of Brookhaven. And then I went on to be the supervisor, and now I sit here today. I represent Mr. Trump on CNN and Fox, and I was supposed to be on MSNBC tonight, so you can vouch for me with Chris Hayes that I was here. And it's amazing that the first shows that I went on, it was all about, oh, he can't win, not a real candidate, then he's winning. And every little thing, it's like we have these debates. The primary ends, he wins, and now we're saying the same things into the general election. And there's a lot of people, when you look at these polls, don't believe any of the polls. First of all, they don't use uniform methodology, which is bizarre. They poll different percentages of different types of people. So you really got to look at the polling entity and see what methodology they use. But there's a lot of new voters, a lot of people that have been sitting on their couch saying my vote doesn't count, and they never come out. In virtually each and every one of those primary elections, Donald Trump exceeded what the polls said. If it said he was up by 5, he won by 10. If he was down by 3, he won by 5. Why? Because you have all these people, because they're not likely voters, so they're not going to get him on the phone. They're not in our database when we're calling people to say, we got to think about likely voters, right? Only half the people that are eligible to vote are even registered to vote, and only half of those people come out in a presidential election. So only 25% of the people are even going to decide what the future of America is. So how Donald Trump is going to win, he's going to continue to talk to the people that are disenfranchised, get them off their couches, get them participating. It's bizarre that in Zimbabwe they have like a 99% turnout and they have like 20 candidates on the ballot.
John
But in
Podhoretz.
America, we're 25% on it.
John, do you agree with the other John?
No. The story of the primaries was that Trump led from 2 weeks in, and everyone, including me, said, oh, he'll fade. He'll fade. He'll fade. He never faded. He grew. He went from 16 to 26, 27. He stayed there for about 5 or 6 months, climbed into the low 30s, and no one ever got near him. And the polling in the primaries was extraordinarily accurate. What you say is not true. It is not true that the polling was wrong. And the polling now shows him down by 8. It is extraordinarily unlikely that he can win the election. He
Four
is
in
now
Bloomberg.
behind, excuse me?
4 in Bloomberg. The latest Bloomberg poll is 4.
Congratulations. He's down by 8 in the poll of polls. He's down in Pennsylvania by double digits. He's down in New Hampshire by double digits. He's down in Florida. He's tied in Georgia. He may lose Utah. We're not talking about a defeat here. It's much more likely that he will lose in a landslide than that he will win. Now, that is because I'm looking at the numbers, not because I'm not. That is because I'm looking at the way he's behaving, not because I'm not. There is no time for growth. We are almost at Labor Day. The difference between Labor Day now, the election after Labor Day, is that the conventions used to be the last week of August and the beginning of Labor Day, and they were moved back because of the Olympics this year. And so that dynamic is over. You're not going to have those audiences, those huge audiences, until the first debate, which is the September 23rd. And voting begins in 5 states before the first debate. So there are possible, wild exogenous things could happen. Something could come out from WikiLeaks. Something could come out about the emails. Some huge scandal could envelop her that could take her down. But Trump will not be the person, will not be the reason that she loses. She will be the reason that she loses. Right now, Trump will lose this election and will lose it substantially.
Katrina?
I have to say I tend to agree with John. It may be a first. But there was a story a few months ago, Thomas Edsall, the very fine New York Times correspondent, did a story about polling. And it was like the reverse of the Bradley effect. If you remember the black mayor in Los Angeles, people said they were going to vote for him, and then the polls didn't reflect those votes. And in this case, it was the inverse. People on the phone denied they were going to vote for Trump, but online the polls soared for Trump. I too think polls can be very fragmented. You need to look at state polls. These national polls don't mean a lot. But if Trump was doing what you're talking about, John, he might be doing well, talking about jobs, jobs, jobs. But every day he's insulting new groups of people. I mean, insulting Gold Star families, insulting women. The story in the Times a few days ago, a woman said, I was for Trump. I like political incorrectness, but there's only so much I can take. And I think, and I'll stop by saying, I also understand there's a whole network, we didn't talk about it much here, of alternative media, of right-wing media, of Trumpian media, which we're not plugged, I'm not plugged in, and we have a correspondent following it, some of it.
I'm sadly very plugged.
So what do you, but that could be something we're not paying attention to. And it could be like the Brexit vote, where people were shocked. But I tend to think that Trump will be defeated. And Trumpism, however, will continue, which is a different discussion.
Trumpism will certainly continue. And remember, Brexit was ahead in May, and then it fell behind just before the election. So again, I think what we have here is we have pretty solid data to suggest that this state of the race is very unfavorable to Trump.
But that begs the question, which I'm going to paraphrase from here. It's a very polarized election. People are very angry. People accept their own set of facts, be it conservative or liberal, whatever, Democrat, Republican. And we have a candidate, Donald Trump, who's made the claim, and this goes to your longer range concern, Howard. He's made the claim that the election, not just the Democratic primary, the election is rigged. Is there a concern, when you consider the polarization, and you consider that if Donald Trump, if you're right, all of you, or 3 of you are right, that Donald Trump loses this election, that his angry supporters may in fact feel like it's time for us to do something about this?
Well, I think that's a concern. Sure, it's a concern. One of the reasons that it's so horrifically irresponsible for him to be peddling this line, which is 3 months before the election, he is establishing the predicate for the idea that he would have won the election if everything had been fairly done toward him. And he got this idea because he didn't win Iowa, and he decided in his head that this was because of an email sent out by the Cruz campaign to Carson voters, which is preposterous. But so he established this line, he used it against Cruz, and like everything in the general election, all he is attempting to do is scale up the things that he did for a Republican primary electorate to everybody else. And yes, he got 13 million votes. He needs 5 times the number.
14.
Okay, great. So he needs 4.7 times the number of votes that he got in the primary to win the general election. He has to scale way up. And the truth, and I speak as a conservative, and I speak as a very serious believer in the things that I believe in, but the truth is that the country has been trending away toward conservatism and trending away from conservatism for the last 5 elections. I mean, if you combine Gore and Nader in 2000, you get 3 million more votes than Bush got. If you take 2004 out as a wartime election, You obviously have 2006, you have 2008, you have 2012, 3 elections in which Democrats made up 39 to 40% of the self-described electorate, and Republicans made up 31 to 32%. Republicans then won midterms where the electorate is 30 to 40 million people smaller. The country is more Democratic than it is Republican. It always has been. That's been a fact forever, but they were coming closer to parity, and then they blew it out. Number one. Number two, which means that the Republican candidate for president has to do outreach to the center, has to do outreach to minorities, has to do outreach to persuadable voters. Exactly what Trump doesn't do by running as though he is running in the state of Iowa, and as though the state of Iowa, the Republican caucuses in Iowa, are the United States.
John, Ted Cruz wasn't going to do outreach to the center. I mean, let me just step back to the question.
How do you know Ted Cruz wasn't going to do outreach to the center? You don't like Ted Cruz, but Ted Cruz would have been a much more conventional candidate.
No, he would have
been a much than Trump. You don't think Cruz would have been a much more conventional?
Here's my point.
Someone else speak.
Here's my point.
This is an idea.
Donald Trump didn't appear out of nowhere. The Republican Party over these last decade has, with birtherism, with extremism, veered away from what it once was. And you see, I think the Republican Party has worked overtime to delegitimize every Democratic president since Jimmy Carter. I mean, I'm not in love with the Clinton. The attempt to delegitimize Bill Clinton, the attempt to delegitimize Barack Obama, it frames what we see with Trump. So this idea that Trump is extraordinarily irresponsible in what he's saying about the illegitimacy of this coming election, I think it is irresponsible, but it's not untethered from a Republican Party that has played those games.
I just said the country is more liberal than conservative. I would think you might want to take the credit of that.
But John, wait a minute. John,
the gift that I offered
the country may be more.
Speak afterwards.
The country may be more progressive. But why have we seen the obstacles, the grip of extremism on our politics and on our media? We're seeing change, but not at the rate we should.
Let's get John Jay's.
But Donald Trump's, first of all, once again, he is not a politician and does not speak politically correct, and he doesn't speak politically speak, right? You don't agree with that? So, when he says the system is rigged, and good thing he is, because whether you like or dislike any of his positions, thoughts, words, it's one of probably the most important candidacy that we've seen, for the purpose that he forced the politicians to talk about things they didn't want to talk about. Because forget about how you feel substantively about immigration, illegal immigration. He made them talk about it. They didn't want to talk about it. The laws that are on the books right now were passed by both Republicans and Democrats and both types of administrations, yet they don't enforce them. There'd be a lot of this social unrest would go away if they actually enforced the laws that they voted for. And if they didn't like those laws, then change those laws. But that's the common sense. When he says that the system's rigged, he's not wrong. If you look at both parties, we have bizarre sets of rules that
John,
we get to make.
System is, I just want, for definitional purpose, system is rigged in terms of the election or the primary season?
Let's talk about the primary, because that's where he first came out with the comment. Some states have these laws where legitimately you could win the majority of a vote in a democratic republic that we live in and not get the majority of the electoral votes? How does that work? Is that the America that we thought we were buying into? And then on the Democrat side, well, forget it. No, the point is, and you know what? You have a point there. That's what I'm saying. So you don't have to just be so partisan that, oh, Bush this, Bush that. And by the way, both parties minimize the other's president. It happened to Ronald Reagan, it happened to George Bush, and it happened to George Bush again. That's true. It's how American politics works. And by the way, it rolls all the way back to when it first started. That's the way the system is. But when he says that it's rigged, there's a lot of the laws that are made to protect the interest of the political leaders and of the political establishment. That's a fact. It is what it is. In the Democrat Party, they had these superdelegates.
That's not
one
what
of the
Reagan-
reasons
that's
why
not
it was
what he's
56-44.
I
That is
agree
what
with
he's
you.
referring to.
I agree
I
with you.
speak with him directly. Don't tell me what you think he's referring to. I'm telling you what the facts are.
I don't
He's
care whether you
watching
speak with him
Sanders.
directly or not.
Because,
He
by the
says
way,
things
can
that
I
are
finish?
interpreted by the ears of voters,
Pollsters-
not by people
no,
in private
and I'm gonna tell you,
conversations.
when I came out for Donald Trump, a lot of people said, "Are you crazy? You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to be with the establishment. You're not supposed to be with someone criticizing the establishment." You know why I did? Because the system's broken. I see it from the inside. And I have 3 boys, 11, 9, and 6. And I see the world that's coming at them, and I'm really nervous. I'm really, really
I have
nervous.
3 children, and
Oh,
they're 12.
absolutely.
I have
Because
3
I don't know if
children,
they're gonna live
and
long
they're
enough.
12, 10,
Equal
and
time
6.
for the other parent.
I have
Go
3
ahead.
children, and they're 12, 10, and 6, and I am terrified of the thought that the country is going to be run by either one of these people. So congratulations. I don't think the system is rigged.
Could I just say a final word? We have a former presidential candidate on the panel. A final word, Howard Dean.
About whether the system is rigged? In general, no, not for want of trying from time to time. I think Lyndon Johnson had a lot to do with Kennedy's election because of Texas. And you know, I obviously think when George W. Bush became president by 1 Supreme Court vote, that was probably the worst or the second worst Supreme Court decision ever, because it was a 5-4 majority. No Chief Justice I ever knew of either party would ever have done that 5-4. It was a total undermining of what people believed in, and I think that had a lot to do with where we are. But I don't think, look, I think there's a hell of a lot more honest vote counters of both parties in this country than there are dishonest vote counters, and I don't think the system is rigged. Have there been attempts? Yes, multiple. Look, let me close with this. This will make you feel better. You want to know why politics is such a tough business? Because it's a substitute for war. Just think about this. Politics is about asset allocation and succession. And for thousands of years, we killed each other in huge numbers over asset allocation and succession. So if you want to know why it's such an ugly, dirty business, and you know it's hard to like anybody in the business, it's because even though we hopefully don't kill each other in large numbers, although I see in some right-wing whack job places on the net, the Clintons are being accused of murdering Vince Foster again. But even though we're not killing each other in huge numbers over asset allocation and succession, the motivations for power are still just as strong. So it's an ugly business. On the other hand, again, I look at the glass as half full. It is a much better, and it's one of the reasons I believe in globalization and interdependence, because the more of that we have, the less that we're going to resort to the kind of violence that we have done. I mean, I was very upset by Brexit. Why? Not because I think the European Union is an wonderful place that works perfectly and there's no bureaucracy. It's not, and it drives everybody nuts. But this is an experiment, much like the one in 1776, which elevates human beings and which seeks to extinguish nationalism and religion as a source of war on the most violent continent on the face of the earth for 1,000 years. I remember trying to learn European history. It was the 1,000 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the Roses' War, the Tudor Wars. I mean, this is insane. This is doable. We can uplift ourselves as the founding fathers in this country did when they completely reset what human beings are supposed to think about each other and the relationship of human beings to their government. That's what the genius of the foundation of America was. Didn't make us any better people, but it did establish a new, higher bar. Do we meet the bar? No, we don't. But we try and we get closer because the bar is higher. That's what this is really about in the long term. So this has been a great discussion. I appreciate it. I actually turned out I like this guy, even though he's the chairman of the party, because I think that I certainly would never vote for his candidate, but I get what he's talking about, and I get that a lot of Americans are concerned about the things that he's concerned about. And I think if we elite here in East Hampton, if we don't answer these problems and make this system fair for everybody, we don't expect everybody to be able to earn $1 zillion, and we're not for 90%, well, maybe Katrina is, we're not for 90% tax rate. No, I'm kidding, I was kidding, that was a joke. She's a friend, we've known each other forever. I couldn't resist.
Eisenhower was.
I know.
Eisenhower.
We couldn't, I'm not for all, there's too much redistribution, we have to have some, but I am for having a system where everybody believes that it's fair. The problem is not that it's not fair. The problem is that people don't believe it's fair. They believe it's rigged.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to feed that beast. I think we ought to unrig it to the extent we can. And I do think that's going to happen. I actually think Hillary's going to be a great president.
Very good. On that note, I want to thank the panel and thank the audience.
I make William Howard.
You make one.
Thank you.
I think you're right. I wish we'd serve in the same legislature. We can make deals.